frost-carved maps on the window glass, thin white rivers spreading from the corners. Anna pressed her palm to the glass, and her twin sister Sophia placed hers beside it, their hands identical down to the small scar on the left thumb from the day they learned to split wood. Outside, the November wind sang sharply across the flat expanse of Blackwood Plains territory, a place so cold that spit froze before hitting the ground. They were 17 years old, and they had been alone since fever took their parents 3 months ago. The cabin they'd grown up in still stood a mile to the east, but it belonged to the bank now, sold to cover debts they hadn't known existed. The village constable, a man named Dawson with kind eyes and an apologetic voice, had given them until spring to find housing. It was a generosity that felt like a sentence. The boarding house charged $2 a week per person, money they didn't have. The church relief women offered to take them separately into different homes, where they could work as hired servants. Anna and Sophia thanked them and refused. They didn't want to be separated. Now they sat in a drafty back room of the general store, where Mr. Sullivan let them sleep in exchange for sweeping and stocking goods. The room smelled of burlap and lamp oil. Their belongings fit in one trunk. Anna sewed shirts for Mrs. Harrington at 5 cents apiece, and Sophia washed linens for the hotel. But the combined income barely covered food. The cold was a physical weight. It pressed on the walls, seeped through the floorboards, settled in the bones. They slept in every layer of clothing they owned. Then Mr. Sullivan knocked on their door one morning in late November and said that an old trapper named Elijah Hawkins had frozen to death 2 nights ago on the road from his claim. The claim itself, a remote parcel of land on the plains near Silver Creek Ridge, was being offered for unpaid taxes of $40. If no one claimed it within a week, it would revert to the territory. Mr. Sullivan looked at them with an expression they couldn't quite read. Perhaps concern, or the careful neutrality of a man who didn't want to influence a decision that could lead to disaster. The man had a structure there, he said, some kind of barrel roof thing made from salvaged materials, probably from an old railroad project or mining camp. It was rough, but it had 4 walls and a door. It was more than they had. Hawkins had lived there 3 seasons, trapping beaver and muskrat in the creeks, selling pelts in the village twice a year. He was a solitary man, not unfriendly, but not inclined to conversation. He'd frozen on the road, returning from the village with supplies, caught in a sudden storm without shelter. They found him 2 days later, already covered in snow. Anna and Sophia looked at each other. They didn't need words. $40 was everything they'd managed to save. Every cent from sewing and washing. Coins wrapped in a handkerchief and hidden at the bottom of the trunk. It was also their only chance. The boarding house would keep them until December, maybe January if they stretched their earnings. But then what? Separate homes, separate lives, the slow dissolution of the only family they had left. Or this, a gamble on a dead man's shelter 5 miles from the village in the coldest winter anyone could remember. They walked to the land office that afternoon through ankle-deep snow. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and crooked spectacles, pulled out a plat and showed them the claim. It was 2 miles from the nearest ranch, 5 from Oak Ridge Village, with no road, no well on record. The structure wasn't even listed as a dwelling, just as an improvement. Assessed value $12. The land itself was considered marginal, too far from water sources for farming, too exposed for comfortable living. He asked if they were sure, his tone implying he thought them foolish. Anna signed the deed transfer in her father's surname, her hand steady despite the cold. They paid the $40. The journey to the claim took them most of a day. They left before dawn with the trunk strapped to a small sled they'd borrowed, dragging it across the frozen ground. The cold was enormous. It made teeth ache and lungs burn. Sophia's breath iced the wool scarf wrapped around her face, and Anna's fingers went numb inside her gloves. They walked in silence, conserving energy, stopping only to rest when their legs trembled with fatigue. The land was flat and white and endless. Sparse brown grass poked through the snow in tufts, and the wind moved across it like something alive. They followed landmarks the clerk had described. A lightning-struck cottonwood, a line of old fence posts, a dry creek bed. When they finally saw the structure, Anna felt her heart sink. It stood alone in the middle of the white plain, a strange curved shape like a loaf of bread made of wood and metal. The roof arched up and over in one corrugated sweep, rusted and patched. The walls were vertical only at the base, curving inward as they rose to meet the roof. Two small windows flanked a simple wooden door. Their glass was so dirty it looked black. A narrow path had been trampled through the snow to the entrance, though the wind was already filling it in. It looked abandoned. It looked impossible. Sophia dropped the sled rope and flexed her hands. Anna walked forward. The door was barred from the outside by a plank laid across two iron brackets. She lifted it. The hinges screamed as she pulled the door open, a sound that scattered a pair of crows from a distant tree. Inside was dark and bitterly cold. A single beam of pale light fell through a crack in the roof, illuminating swirls of dust. The space was larger than it appeared from outside. One long room, perhaps 30 feet deep and 20 wide. The curved ceiling was high enough to stand under at the center. The floor was packed earth, uneven and frozen hard. Against the back wall stood a small iron stove, its pipe extending crookedly through a hole in the roof. A wooden bunk frame with no mattress stood against one wall. A table of rough boards, 3 wooden crates. That was all. Anna walked to the stove and opened the firebox. Inside were the cold remains of the trapper's last fire. White ash and a few charred sticks. She touched the metal. It was like a stone pulled from a river in winter. Sophia came in behind her, dragging the trunk. She closed the door against the wind. The silence that followed was absolute. They stood together in that narrow beam of light. 2 girls in wool coats and long skirts, their breath visible in the air between them. Anna looked at her sister. Sophia's face was pale with cold, but her jaw was set. They'd survived worse things. They'd buried their parents. They'd kept each other alive this long. This was just the next thing. Anna spoke first. "We'll need firewood." Sophia nodded. "And we need to know if that stove draws properly." They set to work. The landscape offered little. No trees grew within sight. Only sparse winter grass and the occasional thorny bush. But a quarter-mile to the east, they found what the trapper had found. A dry gully where cottonwoods and willows had once grown thick before a long-ago flood killed them. The dead trees stood gray and skeletal, their wood seasoned hard by years of sun and wind. Anna and Sophia worked in tandem, as they always did. Sophia held branches steady while Anna sawed through them with an old bow saw they'd found in one of the crates. They spoke little, conserving warmth, but their movements were synchronized. When Anna's arms tired, Sophia took the saw without being asked. When Sophia stumbled in the snow, Anna braced her. They hauled the wood back on the sled, load after load, until they'd built a pile by the door that reached Anna's waist. Inside, Sophia cleared the ash from the firebox while Anna examined the stovepipe. It was dented and the joints loose, but intact. She found a roll of wire in one of the crates and tightened the joints snug. Sophia crumpled pages from an old almanac they'd found and built a small nest of kindling. Anna struck the flint. A spark caught. The paper flared, and the kindling began to crackle. They fed it carefully, adding larger pieces as the fire gained strength. Smoke began to rise. For a terrible moment, it seemed the pipe wouldn't draw and they'd suffocate. But then a draft caught and pulled the smoke up and out. The fire strengthened. Heat began to radiate from the iron. It was small heat, fragile heat, but real. That first night, they slept in their coats on the wooden bunk, pressed together for warmth, with the trunk at their feet. The fire in the stove burned low but steadily. Outside, the wind howled and the metal roof creaked and groaned like a living thing. Anna lay awake listening to it, feeling the cold pressing against her back through the wall. Beside her, Sophia's breathing was even. They'd survived the first day. In the morning, Anna woke to frost covering the inside of the windows in delicate fern patterns. Her breath hung in the air. The fire had died down to coals. She slipped carefully from the bunk, trying not to wake Sophia, and fed the stove until flames licked up again. The light revealed details she hadn't seen in yesterday's gloom. The curved walls were made of wooden ribs like a ship's hull, covered with sheets of corrugated metal. Some sheets had rusted through in places, and cold air whistled through the gaps. The floor was just packed earth, frozen now, but come spring it would turn to mud. The roof leaked where the stovepipe passed through it, and there were other cracks where the metal had pulled away from the wooden frame. This structure hadn't been meant for winter. It was a summer shelter, a way station. The trapper had died trying to winter in it. But Anna saw something else too. She saw that the wooden ribs were sound, cut from good timber and joined with care. She saw that the foundation, such as it was, sat on ground that would drain well. She saw that the orientation faced south, catching what little sun winter offered. Someone had built this with thought. It could be improved. Sophia woke and joined her. They ate a cold breakfast of bread and the last of the cheese Mrs. Sullivan had given them. Then Anna spoke. We can't survive the winter like this. The walls leak too badly. Sophia looked at the gaps in the metal, at the frost patterns on the inside of the walls. We don't have money for materials. Anna walked the perimeter of the room, running her hand along the ribs. But we have these good bones. If we can seal the gaps, insulate the walls. Sophia followed her thought. Earth. We could pack the walls with earth. Anna turned to her. Like a sod house. Sophia nodded slowly. Settlers built entire houses from sod. It holds heat better than wood. We need to cut it in blocks. Layer it against the outside of the walls. Anna looked at the door, at the frozen plain beyond it. The ground's too hard now. Sophia thought. We could start inside, raise the floor. If we bring earth inside and let it thaw by the fire, we could pack it smooth and let it freeze again. A proper floor would stop the cold rising from below. They began that morning. Using a broken spade they'd found behind the structure, they chipped at the frozen ground outside, prying up chunks of earth and carrying them inside in the wooden crates. The work was methodical and exhausting. Each blow of the spade against frozen earth sent shocks of vibration up the arms. The earth came away in irregular chunks, some fist-sized, others larger, all hard as fired clay. By the heat of the fire, the frozen soil softened. They spread it across the floor in layers, tamping it down with their feet, with flat stones, with the spade. It was heavy work. Their hands blistered, their backs ached. Anna's palms cracked where she gripped the spade handle, and Sophia wrapped them with strips torn from an old shirt. They alternated the heavy work, one digging while the other hauled and spread, switching when muscles began to shake with fatigue. The stove had to be kept hot to thaw the frozen earth, which meant constant attention to the fire, constant feeding of wood. But slowly, over days, the floor rose and leveled. They worked in layers, letting each one freeze solid before adding the next. When the final layer was in place, they took the spade and scraped it smooth, then sprinkled it with water from melted snow and let it freeze one last time. When it froze overnight, it froze smooth and hard as stone, and the cold that had seeped from below was sealed away. The difference was immediate. Standing on the new floor was like standing on rock instead of ice. With the floor done, they turned to the walls. The weather had warmed slightly, so the top few inches of soil outside had softened. Using the spade and a knife, they began cutting sod, slicing it into rough bricks the width of a palm. The technique was simple but required precision. Anna cut 3 sides of a rectangle. Then Sophia drove the spade under it to lift it free. The grass roots held the soil together in tough, fibrous mats, creating a natural bond stronger than dirt alone. Each brick weighed about 20 pounds and had to be carried carefully to avoid breaking. They stacked the bricks against the outside of the structure, working from bottom to top, in layers like stones in a wall. The first row went right on the frozen ground, pressed tight against the base of the wooden ribs. The second row overlapped the joints of the first, the way a mason lays brick. Anna worked on one side while Sophia worked the other, and they met in the middle of each wall, fitting the last brick together. Between rows they packed loose soil into any gaps, creating a seal against the wind. The work was slow and required patience. Each brick had to be cut, carried, and laid with care. A brick laid carelessly would crack or crumble, wasting effort and material. Their dresses grew heavy with mud. Their hands were raw and damaged. The injuries from working the spade reopened with each day's labor. But the walls began to disappear under the earthen layer, and the howl of the wind became muffled. They could feel the difference even working outside. The air around the structure grew calmer, sheltered by the rising sod walls. The temperature inside the structure climbed degree by degree, each row of sod adding insulation, holding the heat that had previously bled into the winter air. They worked through December, 2 figures alone on the white plain, bending and lifting and building. Sometimes they saw a rider in the distance, and the rider would stop and watch them before riding on. No one came to help. In the village, when they went for supplies, spending their last meager savings on flour and salt, people looked at them with pity and disapproval. 2 girls trying to winter in that old wreck. They won't last. Mrs. Harrington told Anna she still had sewing work if she'd come to her senses. Mr. Whitaker told Sophia there was a room in the attic she could have. No mention of Anna. They thanked them both and walked back to the plains. By early January, the structure had been transformed. The sod walls rose 5 feet up the sides, thick and solid. Anna and Sophia left openings for the windows and door and sealed the top where the sod met the metal roof with mud and grass that dried hard as mortar. The roof still leaked in places, but they patched the worst spots with scrap tin they'd found. Inside, the space was dark but warm. The heat from the stove no longer escaped through 100 cracks, but gathered and held. They built a second bunk and stuffed mattresses with dried grass. They rendered tallow and made candles. They even built a crude chimney extension from stacked stones. It wasn't beautiful, but it was tight and warm, and it was theirs. Then came the blizzard. It came on a Thursday morning in mid-January, when the sky turned the color of old iron and the wind shifted to blow straight from the north. Anna was outside cutting more sod when she saw the wall of white advancing across the plain. "Sophia," she called. Her sister came to the door and looked. They both knew what it was. They had perhaps an hour. They brought in all the wood they'd cut, stacking it along the inside wall until there was barely room to move. They filled every container with snow to melt for water. They checked the stove, the door, the window seals. Then they went inside, barred the door, and waited. The storm hit like a fist. The wind screamed around the curved roof, and snow drove horizontally across the ground. The temperature dropped even inside their insulated walls. They could feel the cold gathering. They kept the fire hot, feeding it constantly, and the small stove glowed red. The storm lasted 3 days. On the first day, they could still see dim light through the windows. On the second day, the snow piled higher than the windows, and the structure was buried in silence. They lived by candlelight, conserving wood, eating sparingly. On the third day, the wind finally died. Anna pushed at the door, but it wouldn't budge. Snow had piled against it. She looked at Sophia. "We'll have to dig out." They used the spade, working in shifts, tunneling through the packed snow. When they finally broke through, they emerged into a transformed world. The plains were white and smooth. Drifts rose in great waves. And in the distance toward the village, Anna saw something that squeezed her heart. Smoke. Not the thin gray smoke of a stove, but thick black smoke. Something was burning. Sophia saw it too. The village. They looked at each other for one long moment. Then, without words, they began to prepare. They wrapped themselves in every warm layer they had. They filled a sack with what food they could spare. Anna took the spade. Sophia took the rope they'd used for the sled. They began walking toward the smoke. The snow was waist-deep in places, and the walking was hard. They broke trail by turns, one leading while the other followed in her tracks, switching when the leader's strength gave out. The distance that took hours in clear weather took them all morning through the drifts. As they drew closer, they could see it wasn't the village burning, but something on the outskirts. The smoke came from the direction of the church. When they finally reached the edge of Oak Ridge Village, they found chaos. The blizzard had collapsed the church roof, and the stove had tipped over, setting the interior ablaze. Half the village was there fighting the fire with snow, but it was too late. The building was gone. But that wasn't the worst of it. The church had served as an emergency shelter. When the storm hit, a dozen families from outlying farms had taken refuge there. Now those families, perhaps 40 people, stood in the snow with nowhere to go. The boarding house was full. Private homes had taken in as many as they could, but still families remained outside, huddled together without shelter, and night was coming. Anna and Sophia reached the crowd. People turned to look at them. These two girls emerged from the storm. Mrs. Harrington was there, her face smudged with soot. Mr. Whitaker. Mr. Sullivan, the constable. Anna raised her voice. "Our place. The old Hawkins claim. It's warm. It's tight. We have room." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then someone laughed. A bitter sound. "That wreck. You expect us to shelter in that?" Mr. Whitaker shook his head. "It's 5 miles. We'll lose people trying to get there." Anna looked at Sophia. Her sister's face was calm. Anna turned back. "We walked here this morning. The drifts are hard enough to bear weight. If we go now, while there's light, we'll make it." She looked directly at Mrs. Harrington. "You told me we wouldn't last the winter in that place. We lasted. It's warm and dry. There's room for 20 if people don't mind being close." "You're welcome." The silence stretched. Then Constable Dawson stepped forward. He looked at Anna and Sophia for a long moment. "I'll vouch for them. If they say it's sound, it's sound. I'll help lead people there." It broke the spell. Families began gathering children, bundles. Mr. Sullivan found a wagon and a team of draft horses that could break trail through the drifts. They loaded it with the youngest children and the elderly, with blankets and what food they could spare. Anna and Sophia led the way on foot with the constable and a dozen men following. Behind them came the families, a ragged column winding through the white landscape. The journey took until dusk. Twice the wagon got stuck and had to be dug out. 3 times they stopped to let the horses rest. But Anna and Sophia kept moving, and the column followed. When they finally crested the last rise and saw the structure standing alone on the plain, several people stopped and stared. It didn't look like the wreck they remembered. The sod walls rose solid and thick, and smoke curled from the stone chimney. Light glowed faintly through the windows. It looked like what it was, a shelter built to endure. Anna opened the door and led them inside. The warmth that greeted them was like a physical embrace. People packed in, filling every inch of space, and still the warmth held. Sophia fed the stove, and Anna directed people where to sit, where to spread blankets. The families who had scorned them, pitied them, assumed they would fail, now sat in the house they'd built with their own hands. No one spoke much for the first hour. They were too tired, too grateful. But as the night deepened, when the children slept and the adults sat shoulder to shoulder in the flickering light, Mrs. Harrington finally broke the silence. She looked at Anna and Sophia, and her voice was quiet. "We were wrong about you." Anna met her eyes. Sophia sat beside her, their shoulders touching. "You weren't wrong. You saw 2 girls who'd never built anything. You had reason to doubt." Mrs. Harrington shook her head. "But you did it anyway." Sophia spoke then, her voice soft but clear. "We didn't do it to prove anything. We did it because we had to. And now you're here because you have to. That's how it works." Constable Dawson smiled faintly. "You sound like your father." He was a practical man. Anna felt something tighten in her chest. She hadn't spoken of her father since the fever. He would have approved of this. Dawson nodded. He would have. The family stayed for 3 days while men from the village dug out the boarding house and repaired damaged homes. In those days, Anna and Sophia fed them from their stores, managed the stove, kept the warmth steady. It was crowded and warm. When the families finally left, walking back to the village under clear skies, they left gifts, sacks of flour and cornmeal, a ham, a length of fabric, a set of good iron pots. Mrs. Harrington left a quilt she'd sewn herself. Mr. Whitaker left candles and bacon. Mr. Sullivan left a keg of nails and a note. "For your next project." When the last wagon disappeared over the rise, Anna and Sophia stood together in the doorway of their home. The sun was setting, turning the snow to gold and rose. The wind had died to a whisper. Winter wasn't over, but its back was broken. Sophia looked at her sister. "Do you think we'll stay here after the thaw?" Anna thought about it. "There'll be work in the village now. We could go back." Sophia nodded slowly. "We could." They stood in silence, watching the light fade. Then Anna spoke again. "But I think we'll stay." Sophia smiled, a small quiet smile. "I think so too." The structure stood behind them, squat and strange and solid. It wasn't a house in the traditional sense. It was a hybrid thing, part sod house, part shanty, part ingenuity. But it was warm and tight. And it was theirs, built by their own hands from earth and wood and will. In the spring they would improve it further. They would dig a well. They would build a small shed for chickens. They would plant a garden in the soil that would thaw. The land would provide, as it always did for those willing to work for it. But that was spring. For now, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Anna and Sophia went back inside and closed the door against the cold. The fire in the stove burned steadily and warm. They had built something from nothing. And in doing so, they had built themselves. The plains would remember them. 2 girls who refused to break, who turned scorn into shelter, who chose kindness when cruelty would have been easier. And in the end, that was the only legacy that mattered. The warmth they shared when the world turned cold. A Share Artifacts download all translation document, MD.